Hi, Jerry. All right. Good afternoon. I'll try to put this somewhere anyway. I want to thank Sherry for that introduction and the archives in general for inviting me here to be a part of the festivities of today. It's a very impressive what's going on, and it's certainly a marvelous exhibit, and I'm honored to be part of it in my own small way. With the presentation I'm going to deliver, it's a collection of photographs that I've compiled in my book here, and it was about just over a year ago, in fact, that I delivered an Architreats talk where I went over my book when it first came out, and I'm going to pull a selection out. Many of the images, if you've gone through the exhibit, you will have seen them sprinkled around. And what I want to do is to just bring a story to each of these faces, because what often happens when I was certainly doing the research, again, there's hundreds, even thousands of photographs, but oftentimes it's just the name of someone or a unit that they were involved in, but you don't really know the whole story. And that's part of what I think the Alabama Voices theme is trying to get across here, is that everyone, not just the famous people in Alabama or in history in general, but everybody is an important contributor to the historical story, even in their own small way. And while we certainly, when we study history, and I study history, we want to derive lessons and learn from past mistakes, sometimes the task could be just as simple as giving meaning and value to a long-forgotten person who we have just a daguerreotype or a tintype and not much more to say about them. So I've got a few images here I'm going to draw from my book that most of which I found in the state archives here, much of it with the help of the research staff and Bob Bradley in particular. But the cover of the book has got John Henry Turpin, and he's one of the images you might see. I saw it when I went through the exhibit earlier today, and we wanted to find a really striking image to put on the front cover of the book. And John Henry Turpin fits the image here with his arms crossed and a very defiant look. He's a 25-year-old druggist from Greene County, from the Canebrake region down there, and he served in the 28th Alabama. And had this photograph made shortly before seeing action at the Battle of Murfreesboro and the end of December 1862. And he had no idea at the time, but this would be the last image where he had both of his arms. The left arm he will lose at the Battle of Murfreesboro. So, he's on the cover, and he's not the main focus of what I want to talk about here, but he's a really powerful image. And Bob Bradley, if you don't know him, he's one of the great Civil War curators you're ever gonna meet. He helped me decide upon this image for the cover. Let's see if we can get the thing working here. All right. But as I lay out some context for the images, I want to stress that most of my book is about Alabama Confederate soldiers. There are some civilians in there, some politicians, and I'll show an image or two from there. But of the 235 photographs that I try to tell the story of in a chronological sequence, laying out the ordeal of the Civil War in Alabama, most of them are soldiers, Alabama soldiers. And so to give it some context, I wanted to convey to you the magnitude of Alabama's contribution to the Confederate war effort. That's the manpower population in 1860, according to the 1860 census, the adult male population of military age, the 15 to 50 range. And when the conscription acts are passed and modified, some of the politicians in the Alabama State House complained that the governor was taking the sires and the striplings from the land, everybody. And of the 126,000, 96,000 wore the uniform at some point, most of them as volunteers in the regular Confederate military, at least 15,000 as conscripts. But that's about 76% of the population. You're not going to find too many countries or societies that contribute that percentage of their manpower to a war effort. And of that number, approximately 30,000 died of disease or battlefield injuries and wounds. So a heavy price that Alabama paid for the war. When I was trying to figure out what to select from, and Sherry highlighted that, the challenge of what do you include when you have such a rich treasury of images. Well, my criteria for the selection process was I had to be able to clearly identify who the person was and have a little bit of biographical information about them. But then I also wanted to be able to place them in a specific time during the Civil War where I could give a detailed story. A lot of the images will know who the person is, but we don't know much else about them. This is so-and-so, and there's no more story there. Or you have a letter collection by our journal, diary entry where the guy is explaining a lot of exciting stuff, but there's no image to go with it. So it was find the image, find the story, and put it together to tell the entire saga of Alabama. And this is a case in point here. These two gentlemen, we've got Edward Crenshaw and John H. Bankhead. Both of them fought at the Battle of Chickamauga. So Crenshaw's a 21-year-old from Butler County, a law student. He was at the University of Virginia when the war began, immediately rushed back home and joined the what became the 58th Alabama. His father, incidentally, Walter Crenshaw, was the Speaker of the Alabama House of Representatives throughout the war. And then next to him we have John H. Bankhead from what becomes a pretty illustrious family in Alabama history after the war. Pretty illustrious at the time. He's also 21 years old. You got two 21-year-old young men here. Bankhead is the son of a big planter from Marion County, and he was a captain in the 16th Alabama. And so while I had that basic information about them, I was also fortunate to be able to find letter collections and journal entries that bring their ordeal at the Battle of Chickamauga to life, and to kind of capture what Crenshaw was going through, both young 21-year-old men thrown into the ordeal of combat here. And I also think it's interesting that we always think of Civil War soldiers always having big beards, and a lot of them oftentimes do, but these guys, had a little tuft here for Crenshaw and clean-shaven for Bankhead. But at Chickamauga, Crenshaw, this was really his first big battle, even though it comes in 1863. He suffered many bouts of illness throughout the war. And as I pointed out, a lot of the fatalities in the Civil War were from disease. In fact, most soldiers died from illness, and Crenshaw suffered his fair share of bouts with illness before finally getting a chance to, quote, see the elephant, an expression used for a soldier's first real experience in combat, sometimes called seeing the monkey show. You have really colorful ways in which soldiers would convey what it meant to actually go into battle. But he attacks with the 58th Alabama, and at one point in the battle, I won't belabor you with all the details. I give page-length descriptions of what they all go through in their particular moment in the war. But they attack the Yankee forces at one point, and Crenshaw, he's recording this in his diary. He says, with great aplomb, despite going into the chaos of battle, here's a quote, where he says, "I passed a Chinese sorghum patch while double quicking. Charged the enemy with 2 stalks apiece, one in my mouth and one in my hand. I was nearly starved." I can just see him with almost like Huck Finn with the stalk coming out of his mouth, just going into battle. A fierce fight. His men, his company, helped capture a Union battery, 3 cannon. The next day in the battle, however, the exuberance of the fight gave way to a serious wound. He took a bullet to the face, and it tore a serious laceration across his face. So here, as we saw with John Henry Turpin, both of his arms defiantly crossed. He sacrificed that left one for the cause, and Crenshaw suffered his whatever handsome facial features he had for the cause, because he had a terrible scar for the rest of his life thereafter. For Bankhead, fighting on a different part of the battlefield with the 16th Alabama, he recalled engaging in a nighttime fight. Chickamauga, incidentally, is one of the most ferocious battles of the entire Civil War, and it's in the Western Theater, where most of us probably familiar with Gettysburg and Manassas and battles like that, fought in the Virginia or Eastern Theater But Chickamauga, 18,000 Confederate casualties before that battle was over, including Crenshaw, including Bankhead. It's kind of hard to go through that maelstrom and not get hit. But he recalls a nighttime engagement, and these were rare for obvious reasons, very almost pitch black when you go into the fight at night. And so rarely were they conducted. And not surprisingly, Bankhead recalled that as the 16th Regiment was trying to cross a field with little illumination, chaos and confusion reigned. They made contact with Yankee forces on the other side. A firefight erupted, and then Bankhead recalled what he thought was one of the most ambiguous orders he'd ever heard. The battalion commander the regimental commander yelled out, "March in retreat." And Bankhead wasn't quite sure what that meant, march in retreat. And evidently no one else knew what it meant, because about half the regiment continued to go forward, as did Bankhead, and the other half fell back, and the cohesion of the entire attack fell apart. He and several of his other company commanders remembered grumbling about the confusion of the order. The next day, as Crenshaw is suffering his serious wound, Bankhead's regiment continues to fight along the Lafayette Road. They're trying to capture the Brotherton farmhouse. And if anyone's visited the battlefield, it's a small little farmhouse. And I know that the landscape has certainly changed between now and then, but it seems like a pretty small field when I visited the site, and a lot of action concentrated on a few acres of land. But in the course of the attack, which was the 16th attack, is repulsed. But as they're retreating back, Bankhead, artillery shell fragment broke one of his arms, and it was, the record doesn't indicate whether it was left or right, but it's dangling there, and his men are retreating. And a testament to Bankhead's character is he heard a soldier, not from his own regiment, but a Confederate soldier, moaning nearby, with a terrible wound lying in the field, and the grass near the soldier was burning, and the flame was moving toward the wounded soldier. And Bankhead ran over there. Most of his men have already fallen back, and with his one good arm, he hoisted that wounded soldier onto his shoulder and carried him off the battlefield. So these are examples of trying to capture the character and the individuality of each of these photographs. As I tell a larger story. And my intent is, if you get the book and read it all the way through, is you'll come away with a pretty solid overview of Alabama's experience in the entire war. I'll quickly go through a year-by-year selection of photographs. We're back in 1861. It's not, Chickamauga is at the middle period of the war. But back at the early part of the war, there's this rare photograph. You have photographs of individuals, certainly, but here's a rare photograph of an actual unit, Confederate, an identified Alabama unit in the field. And this is a company, probably, from the 1st Alabama Infantry, which was the first official regiment of the entire Confederate Army. And it is bivouacked down at Fort Barrancas in Florida, where the Confederate forces were unsuccessfully trying to gain Fort Pickens, which the Union Navy and Army held on for the duration of the war. But it's just a photograph early on in the war. They're deployed out there in the hot sand and humidity of Florida. An unusual photograph of a unit. Over here we've got Nathaniel H.R. Dawson. Dawson, a prominent Dawson family. His brother is also in the 32-year-old lawyer from Dallas County, Nathaniel Dawson here, and it was a captain in the 4th Alabama. He's a big slaveholder. He's got over 100 slaves. He's a wealthy planter, a hardline secessionist. He was a good friend of William Yancey, and was part of the bolt from the Charleston Convention back in 1860 when the road to secession was unfolding. So he's totally dedicated to the cause. And he has a pretty interesting experience in the course of the war. He joins the 4th Alabama. He will serve at the 1st Manassas, sometimes called 1st Bull Run. Union side often called battles after the nearest body of water, like a river. Confederates usually after the nearest town. But 1st Manassas, and since I'm telling it from a Confederate perspective, I'll use the Confederate battle name. But At first Manassas, the 4th Alabama is engaged in the fight. This is the first big battle of the entire Civil War, and Dawson was really excited to be part of it. And there's a rich collection of letters that he has back to his wife, Mary, whose name is Elodie Todd, if I'm pronouncing that right, and she is a half-sister of Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of the President of the United States at that time. So if there's ever a case of brother versus brother, family against family, family torn apart by the Civil War, the Dawson family, he saw that up close. But he writes a number of letters back to his bride-to-be, and in particular, I was fascinated by the letters where he kept talking about this brand new British-made 5-shot Adams revolver that he had just got and was carrying around with him, a beautiful weapon. And he claimed that he could hit a target at 200 yards with this thing. And with a pistol, that's impressive if you can hit something at 200 yards. Well, in Bull Run, he was going to put that claim to the test. But in the course of the fighting, the 4th Alabama is bound up in the fray and would be near Bernard Bee when he famously referred to Thomas Jackson of the Virginians, saying, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall." It was the 4th Alabama that was present to hear the inauguration of the famous Stonewall Jackson name. But in the course of the battle, Dawson recalls trying to climb up on a fence rail where he could get a better field of vision, and a cannonball hit the fence and knocked him 10 feet into the air, and he landed and he broke his ankle. And so he's hobbling around on one foot as the Yankees are conducting an attack at that part of the field, and everything's falling apart. And all of the regimental officers are killed or wounded or injured, including himself, and the 4th ends up falling back off of the field. He called it, the disorder was indescribable, he rewrote to his wife. And yet he then ended it by saying, "Nevertheless, it is honor enough to have been in the battle and to have done my duty." He later added with some embarrassment that in the confusion of the fight, he actually forgot to fire that pistol that he was so proud of. He never discharged a round. It just for whatever, he was carrying it, but for whatever reason, he was orchestrating fire. But it's funny how psychosis can hit you like this, and what you always intended to do just never seems to happen. 1862, I offer these two photographs as a contrast of a famous Alabamian. Many of you may be familiar with John Pelham, the gallant Pelham, as Robert E. Lee called him, a young 24-year-old former West Point cadet, from Calhoun County, which was a hotbed of secession in the state, and famous for his artillery feats. A young daredevil, reportedly a heartthrob with the local girls. I'll leave it to you all to decide if his look there matches the reputation. He will be killed in action before the war is over, and poems would be written about him, and there's actually a new biography in the museum bookstore on John Pelham, one of the famous members from Alabama. But I try to, as much as possible, find obscure Alabamians, people that you're not as familiar with. So you're not going to see. There are some generals in my book, but it's a lot of junior grade officers and enlisted men. Try to tell their story. And while Pelham certainly deserves all of the plaudits that historians give him and contemporaries at the time, let's not forget the Marcus Westbrooks of the Confederate Army. He's a yeoman farmer. That's a non-slave holding. He's got his own farm in Cherokee County. He's 21 years old at the time, just starting a family. A small, 40, 50 acre farm, hard scrabble yeoman. But when the secession occurs, he is one of the first to volunteer, serving in the storied 19th Alabama, and will see action at Murfreesboro. He sees action throughout the war. He's a Confederate soldier from the beginning to the end. What's noteworthy about him, and this comes from regimental files and records, is that despite his skill as a soldier, he was a great shot and was a cool customer in battle. He often would crack jokes and calm the nerves as they marched into battle, and could always be counted on to be in the thickest of the fighting. And many times his officers wanted to promote him, and he steadfastly refused it. I'm a private. I'm staying a private. I'm a common soldier right to the end. I'm not going to become an officer. I'm not going to become a sergeant. He did, right before battles would begin, however, he would accede to his officers' wishes to become a temporary acting sergeant within the regiment, and he agreed to that. And at Murfreesboro, he fought alongside one of his comrades who wrote that, "I saw more dead men in one field than I saw in the whole Shiloh battle," which the 19th participated in. So Westbrook is in the midst of all the fighting, was wounded at Murfreesboro, but as soon as the battle was over, true to form, he went right back to being a private. He totally dedicated to the cause, a good, reliable, common soldier. This is the kind of guy that helps me understand how it is that the Confederate Army perseveres for 4 years against ever overwhelming odds. You got enough guys like this that can. You got your Lees at the top, but you got to have your Westbrooks at the bottom in order for the war machine to persevere and prevail. And one other thing to say about these guys is Westbrook is, of the images I've shown so far, is the only non-slaveholder in the group. And there's often, Crenshaw's family, Bankhead, Dawson. In the Civil War literature, and it was part of the propaganda at the time, was that those that were becoming Southerners who were disillusioned with the war often threw around the expression, "It's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight," as if to suggest that it was the slaveholders that plunged Alabama and the rest of the South into the war, and then they made all the Westbrooks do all the fighting. I'm in the scholarly camp that strongly disagrees with that assertion. You've got a lot of planters or planters' sons fighting, dying, sacrificing at the front. There's certainly planter families that are skulking around in the back trying to avoid making any sacrifice, but it's too simplistic to call it a rich man war, poor man fight. 1863, the Confederate high moment of the war. This is from 63 on, the war is going to increasingly move beyond the Confederacy's capacity to prevail. And there I use this image, both of these images, the story I tell about Adolf Proskauer comes from Gettysburg, and then here's a photograph from Gettysburg itself, that quintessential battle of the American Civil War. And here I use these images to contrast glory and humor with the cold, hard carnage reality of what the Civil War is. Proskauer is a 25-year-old bookkeeper from Mobile. He's also a German Jewish immigrant. Only in the 1850s, he came to Mobile, a bookkeeper down there in an office. And then when the war came, he joins the 12th Alabama and served most of the war in the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's famous army. He was dubbed by his men and those who met him, and this is a quote from the regimental files, "the best-dressed man in the Army." And he looks pretty good there. That's a nice photograph. Well, nice little mutton chops, and he was very fastidious, and even on campaign trail was known to try to keep his uniform as neat and his boots polished as much as possible, and this had an endearing quality with his men. He was a very good officer as well, and he had a big taste for fried onions and other strange cuisine and concoctions that he would put together in camp and try to entice some of his soldiers to eat. But in battle at Gettysburg, he was the acting commander of the 12th Alabama, and on the first day of the battle, again, without belaboring the details, the 12th is coming in from the northern side of the town, heavily engaged, and an officer who's responsible in large part for much of the regimental history, he wrote, and here's a quote from it, he says, "Our gallant Jew major smoked his cigars calmly and coolly in the thickest of the fight." The Jew major. standing against the enemy. And he was, he's not just a skilled tactician, but he was compassionate too. He had a horse, and a lot of officers would ride around on a horse, but he dismounted and used the horse to carry wounded soldiers off the field as quickly as possible, while he walked the line, smoking those cigars, apparently, orchestrating the fire. But while there's some humor when one looks at someone like Adolf Proskauer, the best-dressed man, the Jew major chomping on his cigars, there's a real price to be paid that we can't ever forget, and that's that hundreds, thousands of young men, both sides, are dying, and in this case, the Battle of Gettysburg. This image comes from the slaughter pen, which is located between Little Round Top and Devil's Den, if you're familiar with the layout of the Battle of Gettysburg. And on the second day, July 2nd of the battle, these men are from the 44th Alabama. They were the Evander Law's Alabama Brigade, which includes the 44th and the 15th, which is famously commanded by William Oates, who nearly captures Little Round Top. The 44th walked into this slaughter pen, and they were ambushed by a Union regiment from the 4th Maine. And literally within seconds, according to those that survived it, 24 Alabamians were killed and almost 60 others were wounded in a flurry of gunfire that lasted 10, 15 seconds. And these are among the fatalities. They're bloated bodies. This is Alexander Gardner, a famous northern photographer, visited the battlefield and took this shot. So while we've got the dapper Proskauer here fighting on a different part of the battlefield, I sometimes can get carried away talking about the glorious side of the war, but there's a horrible human carnage that's associated with it as well. And these are unidentified. We know they're from the 44th Confederate soldiers, but other than that, we don't know their story. And yet, it's a real story, a real contribution. 1864. The war in this year really hits home hard for Alabama. There was the blockade all along against Mobile and Union cavalry operations up in the Tennessee Valley. But 1864, the war is falling in on the entire Confederacy. And I use the image here of Mary Jane Chaddock, a civilian woman from Huntsville. She's married to the Reverend William Chaddock, who was also an officer in the Confederate Army. She has a rich diary that Nancy Rohr, who's given talks here before, has transcribed and annotated, and it's from that source that I draw a lot of my material for the Chaddock entry. And I try to capture what the experience was like. Husband away, Union forces having occupied Huntsville. What's it like to her? Because she's dedicated to the Confederacy. And she's especially alarmed by the Union Army's impact on slavery. She owns 5 house slaves in her home in Huntsville. And one of her domestics named Corina was associating with and interacting with the Union forces and would eventually run away. The Emancipation Proclamation and the presence of the Union Army didn't take long for the African American population to realize that the slaves, that the death of the Confederacy meant their freedom, and they left. Whenever the Union Army showed up, thousands of slaves would congregate around the Union Army. And some of these entries I try to capture what Mary Jane feels about. And there's some harsh language in here that's not, we wouldn't necessarily think is ladylike. But she says, "I had to cook for the entire family," she noted after Corina ran away. Imagine that. But she goes on and she says, the presence of the Yankees and Corina running away, this is a foretaste of what we will have to go through when the rebellion is quashed and the wonderful Yankee nation gets possession of niggerdom. A pretty hard-edged line there. She's committed to the Confederacy and cannot really conceive of a world without the institution of slavery. In fact, toward the end of the year, she wrote in her journal when she realized it was over. She says, "We cannot believe that a just God will suffer such an enemy to triumph over us." So that mentality, enduring, even in the face of defeat, just this incredulity, this disbelief, and now a psychological readjustment that has to be made as the war comes to an end. One other quick image here for 1864, Alfred Scott. He is in the 9th Alabama, 23-year-old from Butler County, a young planter wannabe. He's just getting started there, and I've got the hook's about to pull. Let me finish this one. Stay back. Sorry. He grew up in Spotsylvania, Virginia. And it's remarkable when you study the Civil War how often when one talks about defending their homeland, it's not often that we will literally defend our physical homeland. Because he's in the 9th Alabama in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia fighting at the Battle of Spotsylvania. His adult life is Alabama, but the war took him back to his childhood home in Spotsylvania County, and at the Battle of Spotsylvania, he is fighting there where as a youth he was running through the forests and playing. And he wrote in his diary, and I'll get close to the wrap-up point here, he remarks how the battle, and Spotsylvania is another one of these bloodbaths. It's like all the battles are these massive bloodbaths. But he says that the battle alternated between the surreal and the savage. He says, "I passed under a heavy cherry tree. And as I did so, I distinctly remember the shower of the bits of leaves floating to the ground in the still, sultry air. And then the Yankee regiment opens fires. And he says, if the bullets had been sweeping closer to the ground, I don't see how many of us would have gotten through." So in this, he's fighting very near the Bloody Angle, which is one of the most hard-fought pieces of real estate anywhere in North America, bodies stacked on top of each other in the hand-to-hand back and forth there. But I just found that fascinating, that contrast between he had the moment to pause and see these leaves from a cherry tree fluttering to the ground as the maelstrom and crescendo of battle was roaring all around him. But that's what I try to do here. I've got some more images, but I'll stop there. I think I've given you a sufficient flavor of both what's in my book and the richness of the story of all Alabamians, famous as well as common. Thank you.
Raise your hand, Marcus, or I will give you the microphone and speak directly into it so that it will be recorded. We have one right now.
First, you get a copy of your book and put that in here.
I don't know. Are they in the bookstore? Say yes. I don't. If not here, the Goat Hill bookstore, they've had them there before. And Capitol, is that the one in Cloverdale? I know for a fact they've got copies there. Then, of course, there's always Amazon. That's the increasingly favorite go-to place to find just about any book these days. Yes, ma'am.
The man that refused to have his status upgraded to other than private, was there more money?
Well, yes, there is. If I remember it right, I think privates made about $13. I don't think that Westbrook here is motivated by financial reward, because really the difference between a private and a sergeant is not that much. An officer, you start getting into some real money, $45 for a lieutenant, up to over $100 when you hit the field grade rank. But one thing that all Confederate soldiers realized is it didn't really matter what your salary was. The paymaster almost never showed up, and the Confederate money increasingly became worthless as the war went on. So it almost didn't matter what your base pay was. You might not ever see it, and then if you ever did see it, you'd maybe write a letter on the back of it, because that's about all it was worth. No, he's exceptional in that regard. Most people offered a promotion would take it. But I just found it really telling about the man's character, a little insight that he refused the laurels of promotion and just wanted to fight or serve his country.
I would like for you just to clear up something for me here. I've been to Gettysburg twice, going around it, and you mentioned the slaughter pen. And two trips, I never did see that, but I got to the Devil's Den,
Right.
which looked almost exactly like this. Now, my question is, where is that in relation to the Devil's Den?
All right, we'll have to imagine a map here. If this is the Little Round, if you know where Little Round Top is, say that's Little Round Top where I'm pressing, and then Devil's Den is off to the, I guess to the west of it. In between, there's a gorge and a little creek called Plum Run. I don't think it still has much water in it anymore. But that was a gorge between Devil's Den and Little Round Top was where what became the slaughter pen is located. And the 44th just was misfortunate enough to walk right into that ambush. The survivors did press through with good military doctrine is when you're in an ambush, you charge into the ambush, and those that survived bayoneted their way into, and they took the position. But that's just one of many locations. Yeah, it's a rock clustered area, and between the slaughter pen and Plum Run and Devil's Den and Little Round Top, the terrain kind of just melds together.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have another question?
How many regiments did Alabama have?
Repeat the question.
How many regiments did Alabama have? Officially, they have 63 infantry regiments. And most of those had been raised by the autumn of 1863. There's a couple of others that would be added on, a conscript regiment, and then what was essentially a boys' regiment, a bunch of teenage boys in 1865. There are also between 20 and 25 artillery batteries and 12 to 14 cavalry regiments. And the reason why I'm not giving you specific numbers is sometimes you'd have individual battalions that then might merge together to form a regiment, or you had a couple of cavalry regiments that went by the same number. They were the 4th Alabama Cavalry. There's 2 of them, but they refused to change their numerical designator, so everybody called them Roddy's Cavalry because he commanded one, and Russell's Cavalry, that was the other. Both were the 4th Alabama Cavalry. But about approximately 63 infantry regiments, upwards of 24 artillery batteries, and a dozen or so cavalry regiments. And then lots of militia, home guard type units, which is really hard to decipher who's who there.
Do we have another question? Well, you have about 5 minutes if you'd like to.
Shall I proceed? Okay. I'll get you. The 1865 was why I wanted to get to the end, the last year of the war here. Again, the state will be overrun by Union invaders this year, and I've got just a couple of samples from the book. This one here is on this young lad, 19-year-old cadet at the University of Alabama. Part of the Corps of Cadets. He's originally from Mobile, Green Marshal Labazin. He is on campus when a contingent of Wilson's cavalry sweeps through. Wilson's cavalry raid, which would eventually go on to destroy Selma and take Montgomery and capture Jefferson Davis when he's trying to escape at the end of the war. A contingent was sent to Tuscaloosa to destroy the campus. It was a military school, and the orders were burn it to the ground. And those were pretty common orders for the Union cavalry. Sherman, Sheridan, Wilson, burn everything down until the Confederates finally throw up the white flag. And on the evening of the 4th of April, when the Union troopers arrive, the record lays out that Labazin, as well the rest of the Corps of Cadets, were abruptly awakened. You had the drum beats and bugles were being sounded. The enemy was in the area. And he recalls getting out of bed, bleary-eyed. It's almost 2 in here. And fumbling into his uniform and standing out on the parade ground, and it's starting to rain. And he probably looked very much like this, and just standing there. And he had never seen any action up to this point in time. This would be his first. And he's put in command of the skirmish line of the cadets as they're sweeping through Tuscaloosa to try to make contact with the enemy. And there's rumors they're out there somewhere. And he's leading a skirmish line through the town, off campus. And they encounter shadowy figures. Shots are fired. His skirmish line shoots back. They find the corpses of 3 Yankee troopers after this exchange. Before the dawn, however, the president of the school, Landon Garland, ordered all the cadets to evacuate. Because when the dawn came, he was convinced that when the Yankees closed in on the town, those veteran troopers would overpower his cadets. And so he wanted to save as many lives as possible, and they evacuated. But it's amusing that Labazin would say, he was constantly saying about they would fire by sound, not by sight, that everything, he could hear stuff, but he couldn't see anything. And I make a quip there in the book that for Labazin, he went into the battle having never seen combat, and actually after the battle still had never seen combat. He heard a lot, fired his weapon, but never actually saw anything because it was always dark. The gentleman here, I'll finish with Jonathan M. Stewart. Most of the book, as I say, is Confederate Alabamians, but about 10 to 15% of the population of Alabama were Unionists. And most of them from the hill counties up north or down in the Wiregrass region on the Florida border. These individuals were totally opposed to secession and engaged in guerrilla fighting, or in the case of Jonathan M. Stewart, fled to Union lines. He's a 29-year-old farmer originally from Randolph County, but when the war broke out, he refused to serve. His brothers joined Confederate regiments, and they were pressuring him to join, and he said, absolutely not. You're crazy. The secession's wrong. I'm loyal to the United States. And he had to leave. They would not tolerate his presence, and he went all the way to Lawrence County up in the Tennessee River Valley and joined what would become the first Alabama Cavalry Union. As far as I know, the only official federal regiment raised from Alabama citizens, and he served as a sergeant in the 1st Alabama Cavalry, and in 1865 is where he sees most of his action. He's part of the cavalry escort of William Sherman's march through Georgia and into the Carolinas, and he's proudly considered himself one of Sherman's bummers. Sherman, much maligned in the South even to this day, especially what the bummers just pillaged and burned anything they felt like. And Stewart quite proud of his participation in that. So he's atypical from everybody else I've been talking about. They're all pretty dedicated to the Confederacy, but 10 to 15%. It's a minority, but it's still a substantial number. And as much as possible, I want to show all facets of the war itself. If I could just show one more, and I only mention this one because you've got several 100,000 African-American slaves in Alabama. They're Alabamians too. Their story, if we could tell it, needs to be told is in an individualistic way. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of photographs of slaves with a compelling story to go with that particular image. But this one, I have a chapter on Reconstruction, which in the 1872 Alabama Senate, once the Reconstruction Acts are passed and African Americans get the right to vote, there were 5 African Americans that served in the Alabama State Senate, and I've got their names here, corresponding with where they're standing on this side of the steps. The most famous is probably Jeremiah Harrelson, who went on to also become a congressman from Alabama, went all the way to Washington, D.C. The ordeal of the Civil War affects men, women, black and white, Confederate and Unionist. And so I try to weave their story in where I can find information. Thank you very much.
Well, I've heard, was there some black soldiers in the Confederate, military?
It was certainly slaveholders would often bring one slave who could kind of handle their gear and prepare. And then sometimes slaves were often impressed by the Confederate government to help build fortifications or to be as teamsters and haul supplies around. But the idea of putting them in the uniform, that moment doesn't come until March 1865, and the war is pretty much over. There had been some debate going on in the Confederate Congress and among Confederate generals about should we go as total war as possible and arm our slaves with the promise of freeing those that fight. That did officially pass in March of 1865, but the war ended before any African American slaves officially wore the Confederate uniform. You will find one or two here scattered around in the records that fought, but I know you've heard it, and sometimes I've heard that theory so badly overblown as to make it sound like slaves were commonly serving in the Confederate Army. No, slaves, if they want to fight in the Civil War, they want to wear a blue uniform. And we know for a fact that 186,000 served in the Union Army and another 10,000 in the Union Navy. But that's just to qualify it. They were a source of military labor.
And Dr. Severance will be here for a few minutes after the program if you have questions for him. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.